Hallo und guten Abend. Wir warten noch ein wenig, bis der Raum sich füllt. Das kennen Sie ja schon von unseren Zoom-Veranstaltungen. Das dauert immer einen kleinen Moment. Gleich geht's los. So, die Zahlen stabilisieren sich. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und herzlich willkommen zu unserem heutigen Webtalk zum Thema Israels Sicherheit und der Tag danach. Mein Name ist Frank Weyers und ich leite das Landesbüro NRW der Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung. Mit meinem Team organisieren wir ca. 350 Veranstaltungen im Jahr online, aber auch in Präsenz. Alle unsere Veranstaltungen finden Sie auf der Webseite stiftungfreiheit.org oder auch in unserem Newsletter. Heute sprechen wir über die aktuelle Situation in Israel. Seit über 100 Tagen herrscht Krieg. Wir sprechen mit Oberst Pnina Sharvit Baruch vom Institut für nationale Sicherheitsstudien und Professor danach Orbach von der Hebräischen Universität darüber, wie israelische Sicherheitspolitik nach dem Ende des Krieges aussehen kann. Ich möchte die Gelegenheit hier aber auch nutzen, Sie nochmal auf unserer Website hinzuweisen. Wir haben dort einen ganz speziellen Bereich zum Thema Israel eingerichtet. Den Link dazu stelle ich in den Chat. Schauen Sie dort einmal hinein und lesen Sie die Artikel oder schauen Sie sich die Videos an, die wir dort verlinkt haben. Unser Gespräch heute wird auf Englisch sein. Sie haben die Möglichkeit, über Zoom auch eine deutsche Übersetzung zu hören. Dazu nutzen Sie bitte das Weltkugelsymbol in Ihrem Zoom-Fenster. Des Weiteren haben Sie wie immer die Möglichkeit, über die F&A-Funktion Fragen zu stellen. Aber nun übergebe ich an meinen Kollegen Ras Kraus aus dem Jerusalemer Büro der Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung. Dear Ras, now it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and good evening, everyone. Last week, we also had a Zoom session about the changes in Israeli civil society in the last year and since the 7th of October. And today, as Frank said, we're going to focus on security considerations during the war and mostly after it. A few words about what is happening. I think that most of you, if not all of you, already know that on the 7th of October, the Hamas brutal terrorist attack shook Israeli society and obviously also the perceived sense of security. I think that in many ways, everything changed. And the one thing that I think that most Israelis agree on is that we don't have a choice but to fight and to win due to all the various threats that our very interesting speakers are going to elaborate on in a few minutes. But I think that we're here mostly to understand what does winning look like? What needs to be done? How is Israel going to look after this war? And now, without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers. Together with us today, we have, wait, something popped up. No, excuse me. Okay, I'm not gonna do this. No, okay. So with us, we have Colonel in Reserve and Advocate Pnina Sharvit Baruch from the Institute of the Institute of National Security Studies. And we have Professor Dani Orbach from the Hebrew University. And we're going to quickly say a few words before we start asking them questions. So please, Dani, if you could go first.
Okay, so I'll give a short talk here, and I'd like to introduce three major points about the current war in Gaza. The first is about what I see as the strategic structure of this war, which I think is relatively unique, at least in recent Israeli military history. The second is about the post-war settlement. And I'm going to introduce the key term, which is not always used, called BATNA, Best Alternative to Negotiated Agreement, which I think is very important to understand Israeli position in the post-war when it comes. And the third, I would, just a moment, somebody asked me to confirm my speaking language.
That's what happened to me.
Should I write English?
Yes.
Just a second. Yes. The third, and here I may kind of converge with Pnina's talk a little bit, but from a different perspective. I'm going to give a military perspective or a military history perspective on the problems of international law or on the intersection of international law with the war. I'm not going to say what the law is or give a legal analysis. It's not my domain, but I will say something about how the current international legal regime may influence military operations, and not only in Gaza. I think it's an international phenomenon, which is very, very interesting. The first thing, why this war is strategically unique. Strategy, to say it very shortly, is the intersection between unlimited goals and limited means. I may want to achieve many things, right? But I don't have the means to achieve all of them. Means are always scarce. Means can be money, time, soldiers, anything you can imagine, but means are always scarce. And the art of strategy is to prioritize my goals. What goal I want to achieve first? Do I have the means to achieve the goal? What means am I going to use to achieve this goal? And in wars specifically, and here we may return to the classics, to Karl von Clausewitz, anyone who is engaged in war should always think whether what you want to gain is worth the price. That's usually the situation in a normal. And I avoid no questions of law and morale. This is kind of pure military thinking. And when you decide that the cost is bigger than what you want to achieve, you stop the war and you go for a settlement. That's really from Krieg, from Karl von Clausewitz, kind of basic military theory. This war is relatively unique because there is no issue of cost. And this is very painful, what I'm going to say, but I'm going to explain. Israel should pursue this war for victory regardless of the costs. And this is very rare to say in wars. And I was attacked by other experts to strategy because this is not strategic thinking, to say whatever the cost. And yet, what's happening now in the Middle East is that Iran surrounds Israel with proxies with whom no compromise is possible, because their declared goal, the goal they want to achieve, is to annihilate Israel completely. And any settlement with either one of his proxies, including Hamas, will be only a launching pad for the next war. Therefore, settlement is not possible, doesn't depend on us. Any settlement is a temporary ceasefire that they may break whenever they want and whenever they see the chance. The Iranian strategy is to strangle Israel. Israel will be hit from south, from north, from other fronts, depends on circumstances. It will shrink. Pay attention, you know, people in the south evacuated, people in the north evacuated. If it will go on the territory of Israel, will progressively shrink. And that's how the Iranians see their own strategy of eventually destroying Israel. And in order to survive, Israel needs to break this ring of encirclement around it. And the weakest spot in this ring of encirclement is Hamas. If Israel will not, A, remove the southern portion of the ring of encirclement, and B, take a dear prize for perpetrating such massacre as was perpetrated in October 7th, such attacks will continue relentlessly. Israel now has a unique chance to break this ring of encirclement. So why do I say whatever the cost? Because if we don't do it now, we would have to do it probably in a few years' time with a stronger Hamas, a stronger Hezbollah, and maybe the two of them together. So if now you have to pay the price X, and 3 years from now you have to pay X plus Y, it logically means that you have to pay X now, regardless of the price. That's why it's a war that Israel virtually have to win. And now I come to my second point about the post-war settlement. There are many options for a post-war settlement. My position is not a government position. I believe that Israel has no interest to control millions of Palestinians or to rule Gaza indefinitely. But Israel cannot tolerate a Hamas regime as well. That means, because otherwise we'll have October 7th again and again and again. That means that Israel needs somebody else to take over Gaza, another Palestinian regime, a revitalized Palestinian authority. There are many, many options. But crucial point here, that you cannot say, and Israel cannot say, we will not remain in Gaza no matter what. That would be a very big mistake, strategically speaking. Why? Because of the very important term in the art of negotiation called batna. Batna means best alternative to negotiated agreements. If you want to negotiate an agreement with somebody or reach a settlement with somebody, that person needs to know that you have an alternative. You have a, then what if we don't reach an agreement? Then what? If I'm buying tomatoes and I'm telling the vendor that I must have the tomatoes no matter what, believe me, the price will be very, very steep. And in this case, if we decide in advance that we won't stay in Gaza no matter what, the other actors in the region will not have an interest to take care of a post-war settlement or to bring security arrangements which are acceptable for Israel. So I think that in the post-war, Israel should say several things which are very clear. A, Hamas will not rule Gaza no matter what. This is out of the question. B, we prefer to hand over Gaza to an authority that can create an efficient security regime. There should be several conditions, including an educational reform. We cannot give Gaza to an authority which is committed to educate its children to hate Israel and to destroy Israel. And C, an efficient authority. It could be, we are open to ideas. But if it will not happen, it has to be clear that Israel is going to rule Gaza and to stay in Gaza. Because otherwise, nobody will offer it an alternative. Therefore, we want to get out of Gaza. We want Palestinians to rule Gaza. But if the security conditions will not be fulfilled, the BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement, is unfortunately remaining in Gaza. That's very, very bad to remain in Gaza. It's worse to have a Hamas regime. That's my position. And the third thing, it's not a secret that the international system is now in crisis. You see the war in Ukraine, you see what's happening in the Taiwan Straits, and you see the conflict in the Middle East. I don't need to remind you that World War II also began as several conflicts which were regional and when then were interconnected in 1941 into one big war. So I'm not sure that there will be a third world war, but I'm quite certain that the post-World War II order of norms and laws and rules and international institutions, international law is much less stable than it was, and it's changing very, very, very. After the Second World War, and I'll close with that, the international legal regime became dependent less and less on reciprocity. There were good reasons for it, because in the Second World War, all sides used the principle of reciprocity to say, okay, they violated the rule first, so we will violate it, and it was a race to the bottom of everybody. That was the reason that customary law greatly expanded in the age after the Second World War. Customary law means that you have to do it no matter what your rival is doing. I'm simplifying things. But what I'm saying is that if the international norm is that certain laws of war have to be kept, no matter what your rival is doing, it is logical when most actors are committed to this set of rules. If you have, let's say, everybody is more or less committed to these customary laws, and you have one or two terror organizations which are not, okay, any system may kind of deal with transgressors without breaking the regime of norms, customary norms. But when too many actors ignore this international legal regime and are not committed to this international legal regime, economically speaking, it's like a community that has too many free riders who use the resources of the community without giving back. And any economic system with too many free riders will collapse in the end. And that's why I believe the international legal regime is in crisis and it's in need of reform. I would emphasize that Israel should be committed to the international laws of war. So I'm not advocating violating them, but as a historian, I'm trying to point out what I see as structural problems. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot of things. We're going to go back to many of the points during the question segment. And now, Pnina, please, if you can share your input with us as well.
Okay, so that was very interesting. I missed a little bit because suddenly I was cut off, but so let me start by agreeing that I think Israel has to, I don't know if to say win against the Hamas, but at least not lose, okay? We cannot end this conflict with a victory of the Hamas, and I think that it was explained here from the strategic point of view, and I think it will Israel will lose completely its deterrence, and we have the other enemies, the axis of Iran, as was explained. I would add to it also that that would mean that there will be no chances of ever reaching a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Because the whole idea that we can somehow, wait, I also have to confirm my, where's the English? Now I understand what you, okay, so. Because any idea of finding some kind of compromise here, we have to reach a compromise to have a peaceful resolution of the conflict, entails that we would eventually reach, and I believe in a two-state solution as something maybe down the road, not in the near future, but it entails that from the Palestinian side, they have to accept that Israel is here to stay. And if the Hamas is victorious in some way, this means that Israel is not here to stay, that Israel can be thrown out by force, that there is this potential, because Hamas is not this conflict is not about ending the 1967 occupation, okay? This conflict is about the 1948 or even previously, the whole idea of having a Jewish country here. It is written, the Hamas says it, and even in the South African application to the ICJ, they're talking about the 75 years of occupation. Make that calculation, that's 1948. The whole idea is that Israel cannot be here from their point of view, and if this idea prevails, and that Israel can be chased away, and Israelis and Jews can be thrown out from here by force, why make any kinds of concessions? Because 1967, or accepting the 1967 line from the Palestinian point of view, is a big compromise. And this, I think, also, we're talking a lot about the misconceptions of that we had before 7th of October. So being part of I was involved in all the negotiations with the Palestinians from 1993 onwards, even from 91. I was involved in preparations for the Madrid conference, but from 1993, I was part of the negotiation team, Oslo Accord, etc. And since then, even after retiring track twos, one of them was supposed to be in October. I think what we missed is the understanding that the whole issue of the refugees and the right of return, this idea that one day they will actually return, is a crucial element and a crucial obstacle for peace. And it is not something that I think in the Israeli mind was something that you can solve by some kind of a kind of a package of something symbolic and compensation, etc. No, it's an essential idea, and we see in the Gaza Strip, where 75% of the people are refugees, they grow up from the moment they are born, with this idea that they are temporarily there. It's a temporary place to be until they one day will go back to their homes of their grandparents, great-grandparents already, great-great-grandparents even, inside the state of Israel. And if that is the education, is what is taught from the age of 0, and to get that, the dream of every child there is to go one day and throw out the Jews, kill them if needed, to get back their rightful place. And so I think this is one thing, the whole issue of this concept and the issue of education. If we don't deal with that, and even if we beat, by the way, the Hamas, because the idea of the Hamas, this idea will continue. And UNRWA is part of the problem because it perpetuates this idea of return. It is not there to deal with the making the lives of the refugees better and reinstating them like the other UNHCR body that deals with all other refugees. It's there to perpetuate this idea of return. So that's my first point. My second point, I think, I have many points, but I'll talk about the point of the of the legal front. And I think it was a very interesting point that was brought here about the tension with, in general, the norms, that the laws of armed conflict have to be something that you can live with. And if there are so many conflicts where one side doesn't respect the law and uses the law against those trying to respect the law, we are creating rules that eventually, especially if it is the survival of the state at stake, so no state is going to commit suicide. So it means that it will eventually disregard these very binding interpretations of the law, and then it would start disregarding also the rules that can be maybe applied. So I agree that this is weakening the whole system. But on a more political level, or more talking to, I think what we see here, and we have to understand that we are facing, Israel is facing, and I'll end with that, a combined campaign. And there's a strong interconnection between the military campaign on the ground and the legal campaign in the international front. It is not just criticizing Israel. It is an organized, orchestrated campaign, and both have the same purpose, the same aim, same goal. The military campaign, the goal is to destroy the state of Israel, maybe not now in this round, but to weaken it, to build upon the weakening that they saw in the Israeli society because of all the splits inside the society, and to have this axis with others, so eventually destroying the state of Israel physically. And at the same time, the legal campaign on the international front is aimed at destroying the state of Israel in the conceptual level, the right of the state of Israel to exist, Israel as a legitimate state. And there is a strong connection, because by having this international campaign, this legal campaign against Israel, the idea is that this is used to make it more difficult to Israel, or to prevent Israel from winning on the battleground, because this means that pressure is being put on Israel's allies not to assist Israel, to put pressure on Israel to stop its fighting, which means to enable the Hamas to survive this campaign and eventually win. So there is this connection. It's also in the short run and also in the long run, the idea of delegitimizing Israel, isolating Israel, all these ideas that we see from apartheid state. Now we're talking about genocide. So this is also in the short run and also in the long run, an idea of how to bring about the destruction of the state of Israel, both physically and both as an idea in the international level.
Thank you. I'm already starting to have some questions, and I think I'm going to try and structure them chronologically, if possible. So I'll start with a question to Danny. So on the 7th of October, I think the entire security system in Israel was very much surprised to have this complete failure of the political system, the intelligence agencies, the IDF, and the response was very slow. And I think that many people listening to us today would like to hear your explanation. How could this happen? Because the IDF is regarded as, I would say, one of the better and stronger intelligence forces in globally, and the IDF is considered much more competent than Hamas. And I think this was a surprise for all of us. And I wanted to hear if you have any insights regarding how did we fail so badly?
Like most military disasters in history, this is a multifaceted and multidimensional failure. And I think it needs to be understood as multidimensional. Israeli security doctrine is usually built on three pillars: early warning, deterrence, and military decision. Some add a fourth pillar, defense. And I think it means that you should deter your enemies from attacking. If they attack, you should have early warning. Then you should have a defense line that will hold. And if there is a war, you need to decide it. This is another method, another way of deterring the enemy. All of these four pillars crumbled on October 7th. First of all, there was no early warning. There were many early warnings, but as usual in strategic surprises in history, think of Barbarossa, Pearl Harbor, the Yom Kippur War, it's all the same story all over again. There was what we call a conception. That is, the Israeli system, both wings of Israeli politics, left, right, also center, and the military elite, believed that Hamas is mostly interested in fortifying its rule in Gaza, and of course they want to create trouble in the West Bank. And it was very logical. Why should they endanger the rule in Gaza? So everything they have done and all the information that the intelligence received was interpreted as, you know, we are just conducting exercises, we are just threatening, we are trying to blackmail Israel. The problem was not of information. We had enough information. The problem was interpretation. Also, stovepiping information didn't pass to the right people. This is more technical. The second pillar, defense. Defense needs to have depth and it needs to have redundancy. Depth and redundancy mean that if one defense line fails, then you have other lines who can step in. The line was very, very thin, and too many functions, especially of command and control, were concentrated in one base. So when these functions were neutralized, Israel didn't have command and control, so forces waited for hours instead of stopping this invasion. And also, and I'll end with this, and I think this is crucial, the pillar of deterrence and military decisions both crumbled because Israel became used to a mentality of rounds of escalation, that you punish the enemy, but you end up in some kind of status quo. See how many people in the Israeli elites today are deeply averse to the very idea of victory. And because of that, the enemy could count on the fact that it will never be destroyed, no matter what it does. So there was no deterrence as well. That's why we came to October 7th.
And now that it happened, would you say that the Israeli public perception of the threat of Hamas changed? And if so, in what way?
I think among the public, yes, there is a much bigger support for destroying Hamas, the Hamas regime in Gaza. By the way, I speak of destroying of Hamas as a regime, not necessarily as a guerrilla movement, which is harder, or an idea, which is even harder. Many people conflate these three dimensions, and it's analytically wrong. We speak about the destruction of an open enemy regime, not of an underground. But I think that in the Israeli elites, the defeatism and the mentality of defeat or of escalations, of excessive pessimism is so well rooted that it's very, very hard to uproot it. Also, there is a problem of lack of patience. you know, people think, oh, we didn't destroy Hamas in 2 months, so this war is futile. And they don't look at history, you know, to uproot ISIS from Mosul, which was much easier, it took 9 months. So we need to have patience and we need to want to win, to kind of bring back the passion for victory. That will be the only way we can reach a peace settlement eventually, because then the other side will see that it has a button, it has something to lose, and it will be the only way to survive in the Middle East on the long run.
Okay. Going back to the more to a more legal question, I would say. So Pnina, you earlier said that there is also that one of the more maybe even the most important front, I think, is the legal international front. And I wanted to ask you, because I think that we've seen horrible images from the 7th of October. How can it be possible that even after the atrocities committed by Hamas, we find Israel facing accusations of genocide and having to defend itself at the International Court of Justice? Also, what do you think the implications of the current case brought by South Africa is for Israel, and what do you expect the Israeli government to do in response?
So first of all, as I already said, it is an orchestrated campaign. It's been work. They are building this capacity to fight us, to delegitimize Israel on the international campaign for many years now. And it concerns alliances between pro-Palestinians or actors that are interested in the Palestinian issue, and again, from the extreme side of it also, of not accepting Israel's existence, with liberal, very left progressive concepts, this whole issue today of intersectionality, and they managed to introduce the idea that Israel is part of the colonialistic, imperialistic, white supremacy kind of institution that has, and that the Palestinians are the indigenous population that was, that these colonizers came and threw out of their homes. And there's a whole idea that links to, again, ideas of, today we see among progressive left, among the youngsters, this very strong sentiment. They managed to align themselves with groups with minorities, first of all, but also then with other groups that are fighting against this kind of Western establishment, without really understanding that without Western establishment, these groups will have a very difficult time. Like even you see the LGBT for Palestine, for Hamas almost. So you see that there's also a total misunderstanding. But all this, at one stage, I remember there was, I had an issue with, if I'm a feminist, very active feminist, but that the feminist groups were not ready to have, to talk about, to have anybody speaking pro-Israel, because there's a contradiction between that. And so this is one very big success. And I think it also linked in some places also to anti-Semitism. And I'm not an expert in anti-Semitism, but there are very interesting links being made, how eventually there's always this idea of blaming the Jews. Always the Jews are the group that is the other. So here again, there's also these links. And this has been done on the course of many years. And now we see the fruits of this. Another institution that has been completely, I think, taken over by the pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel discourse and idea is the United Nations, and especially the Human Rights Organization, the human rights apparatus within the United Nations. If you look at there are so many rapporteurs. There's, of course, the Commission of Human Rights, but in general, you have many rapporteurs, including of one specific one on the Palestinian the rights of the Palestinian in the Palestinian occupied territory. They are always very, very anti-Israel. Today, now, you also have Francesca Albanese. She doesn't think we even have a right to self-defense. And there you see from the 8th of October, already declarations, every day almost in the beginning, every few days a declaration by a group of rapporteurs, all very one-sided against Israel. This is already from the first days when Israel was the victim, almost not mentioning the Hamas, what the Hamas did, or mentioning it like very delicately, and you can't even understand that they're talking about the Hamas. There was one about children where they talked about protection of children in Gaza from Israeli attacks and this and this and that, and hostages, which almost seemed as if Israel is holding hostages. This when we still had the children held hostage by Hamas. So when you have and human rights organizations in general, so all this together is a very formidable force. And the impact on Israel, I already said, one impact is, of course, as I said, putting pressure on the governments that are that want to be on Israel's side, like the US government, like many governments in Europe, but putting on them pressure by the public that is brainwashed, not to help Israel, not to support it, not to provide it with, say, military aid. And then also there's larger repercussions of potential isolation of Israel, even sanctions or boycotts, at least, even by international players like big companies. We saw it with Russia, the same attempts with Israel. And of course, putting the issue of genocide on Israel, which is a twisting history on its head, is of course one very powerful tool, because if Israel is somehow perceived as committing genocide, then the pressure on all these actors and on the international companies not to cooperate with Israel, not to work in Israel, to isolate Israel will increase.
Okay. Can you maybe give us an example of the things that Israel is doing to make sure that the IDF conducts itself in accordance to international humanitarian law in general?
Yes, so I was, as you mentioned, I was the head of the international law department in the IDF, and I was until the beginning of 2009, so I was there also in cost-led operation. And one of my jobs was, we started mainly after 2000 to give the commanders and to be in charge of the of the legal advice on operational law. So we had, I actually headed this mechanism. We had legal advisors, first of all in routine, in incorporating all the aspects of the laws of armed conflict into the operational commands, operational plans, into target banks, into means and the methods of warfare. And when there was a high-level ongoing operation, we have legal advisors from the division level up, 24/7 in shifts, and of course in the general staff level and government level. The whole idea is to see to it that Israel abides by the rules of armed conflict. It's of course complex in this environment, but again, the principles are relatively, the basic principles are not so complicated when talking about targeting. The one is the principle of distinction, that you're allowed to direct an attack against a military objective and not against civilians. But again, here we have to understand that the military objective includes all the civilian infrastructure that once it's used by the Hamas for its military operations. And now we see the forces that are coming out on Gaza, they say every house we go into, we find weapons, we find an opening to a tunnel, we find rocket launchers. When this is used, when infrastructure is used, including schools, mosques, including hospitals, by the way, when they are used by the military, they become lawful military objectives. So the law allows one to attack these objects. It is not against the law. They lose their civilian nature. The second principle is the principle of proportionalities, because even when you are attacking this lawful military target, you still have to assess what is the anticipated harm, collateral harm to civilians from such an attack. And then you have to do the balancing between the military advantage sought from attacking this target and the collateral harm anticipated to civilians from this attack. Now, the law says that it is not proportionate if the collateral harm, the anticipated collateral harm to civilians, is excessive in relation to the military advantage expected from the attack. Not extensive, excessive, which means that it gives actually more weight to the military advantage. That's the law. it was devised by military that were fighting. It's a law that is customary in general, in its basis. Here, I think it's very important to understand that what we are fighting now, the Hamas and its infrastructure, the military advantage is very high of most of these targets. And that's why, even if we anticipate harm to civilians, that doesn't necessarily make it a disproportionate attack. And then the other last principle is the principle of, or the rule of precautions, giving feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians. And that Israel is doing, or trying to do, by giving all these warnings, prior warnings, by telling people to leave certain areas before the maneuver is there, by warning people before attacks are planned. This is actually a legal obligation, and it is portrayed, including by South Africa, as you mentioned in the ICJ presentation, and by others, as in itself a breach of a forceful transfer of civilians, while actually it is an obligation to warn civilians to get them out of harm's way. So the law is there, Israel is trying to apply it, but it is being twisted by those from outside, and the Hamas is utilizing the law, as we explained before, to portray Israel as if it is in breach of the law, carrying out war crimes and even genocide, which is of course a ridiculous accusation, but still here we find ourselves being accused of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you would deny claims that Israel is applying what has been called the Dahia doctrine in Gaza?
I think the Dahia doctrine was, again, more a question of deterring the enemy. And here what we are doing is trying to impact their will to fight. And here what Israel is doing is trying to eliminate the threat itself. And the threat itself, as we see now, and there are so many now reports, is entrenched inside the civilian. It's underneath all of Gaza, the underground Gaza city, all used for the military purposes of the Hamas. So this is going after their military infrastructure and not going after destruction just in order to deter them.
Okay, thank you. Dani, I would want to ask you somewhat of a follow-up question to something that you've said earlier. You've said that the current goal is to destroy Hamas's regime and not to destroy the idea that is Hamas. Are there forces in Israel that are talking about destroying the idea of Hamas? And would you say that's something that is even possible?
I think these are mainly people who want to claim or to argue that the war is impossible. Because if you don't want to do something, and a very good way to avoid war is to claim that the task is impossible. Anybody who worked in any organization or in any bureaucracy knows this phenomenon. Bureaucrats who don't want, let's say that the education minister wants to launch a reform. And the bureaucrats in the ministry are less keen on this reform. They will try to find reasons why the reform is impossible. And a very good way to argue that something is impossible is to make the goal more further away, to kind of expand the goal to illogical lengths. And then usually you have the argument, Hamas is an idea. Ideas cannot be destroyed. But we don't speak about destroying Hamas as an idea. We speak about removing a regime. By the way, even the argument that ideas cannot be destroyed is not completely historically accurate. Think about National Socialism. It was maybe one of the most potent ideas in Europe in the 1940s and the 1930s, and not only in the German-speaking region, actually also in the Middle East and in many other regions of the world. It was a powerful idea. Well, it still exists. There are neo-Nazi movements. The idea was not completely destroyed, but the idea is not central to European politics. From the number one threat on the free world, it became a marginal threat, I would say so. Certainly not in the top 5. So ideas could be marginalized. But again, this is much further away than what we're trying to do.
Okay, so let's kind of jump a bit forward into a different idea, since we're here to talk about the day after. And let's talk about the new Middle East. Specifically, I think just before the 7th of October attack, there was a lot of talk about Israel normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia and reforming kind of a regional alliance of sorts. And I wanted to ask you, Danny, if, first of all, if you think that is still an option, and what do you think has changed? Like, is there still hope for a greater integration of Israel in the region after the war?
Well, Hamas planned this attack for several years, but I believe that the timing was decided partly in order to forestall the attempts to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which will be a strategic blow to Hamas in particular and to the Iranian axis in general. The answer to your question is complicated. I don't think that the strategic architecture of the interests in the Middle East has changed completely after October 7th. In most simple terms, Saudi Arabia still has an interest to normalize relations with Israel. They say it quite openly. We find it difficult because of the war in Gaza. But if you have a basic interest to do some things, way may be found. But I think it's also heavily dependent on Israeli victory in the war. Because Saudi Arabia doesn't want to normalize relations with Israel because of excessive love for Israel. They want to do it because they see Israel as a strong state, which they may benefit from the alliance. If you don't show your credibility and your military prowess, nothing will back your diplomacy. That's what people who say, okay, let's solve everything by diplomacy, let's not use military force. It's what we don't understand. When you don't have a batna, I'm going back to this term again and again, when you are not ready to use military force in case diplomacy fails, nothing will back your diplomacy, and your diplomacy will be ineffective. And I think Israel won't be able to do any normalization agreement if it doesn't show that it's still a regional power.
And if I can add, I agree. And as I said before, there will be no peace without us beating the Hamas. It includes regional peace. I also think that part of the story is also the alliance between Israel and the US. Of course, the Saudi was a lot of what the Saudi wanted to get from the peace with Israel was from the US. So again, this ties back to the international campaign. If Israel is also weaker on the international front, is isolated, then again, it's another reason, a disincentive to make any compromises also by the Arab countries with Israel. And another point, but I do think that we also have to mention is that I think another misconception, I spoke about one misconception. I think there's also a misconception to the other, maybe on the other side. I think that the idea by this government that we can somehow push away the Palestinian issue and solve everything without dealing with the Palestinian issue, I think that was a mistake. And the sad thing is that it was a mistake because we can't avoid the Palestinian issue. It's also our own problem, beyond the fact that it is important for example, for the Saudis and others to make any kind of compromise. But now the problem is that the ones that have brought back the Palestinian issue to the table is the Hamas, which is not a good thing. We don't want that will be the impression that only by such force. But unfortunately and inevitably, that is the situation. And if we do want to go forward, I think there is a need to at least talk about some kind of future for some kind of finding a solution to the Palestinian issue, at least to talk the talk and to do things that can also strengthen moderate Palestinians, and also, again, give the Arab world, the international community, this is something that is important. And the fact that at the moment, for political reasons, Israel is now doing that, is putting it in a worse position than it could be in. I mean, we're in a very difficult position as it is, but I think this is making it even more complicated.
Okay. I have another, since we're talking about resolving the Palestinian issue, I have a question from the audience regarding something that you've said earlier about the Palestinian refugees in Gaza. And I've roughly translated it from German, so I'm not sure I'm doing it justice, but why can't the Palestinian refugees go back to where their grandfathers came from in Israel? Like, what's the problem with if we're solving the conflict and we're going to peacefully coexist here, why shouldn't they be able to go back?
Okay, so because we are living in the reality and not in some kind of fantasy world. And if we do reach a compromise with the Palestinians, it's not going to be a compromise where we live together happily ever after. It's not. There is a lot of ideological, religious, cultural, historical tensions between these populations. It's including also economic gaps. So the way to live together is by being separated from each other. It's not, it's like trying to put in one, we need a divorce, not a marriage. And the idea of bringing back all the Palestinian refugees into the state of Israel, where they want to go back is into the state of Israel. And we're talking about just in Gaza, we have 2.4 million Palestinians in general, and refugees, as we said, 75%. There are many more refugees also in the West Bank. There are refugees in Lebanon. There are refugees all over the world. The right of return, by the way, refers to all of them. We're talking about introducing millions, tens of millions of Palestinians into the state of Israel. In Israel, we have around 8 million Jews. This would mean that the Jews become a small minority. We say, and also it's a small country. It's not that there are so many available empty places. They want to go back to their home. Their homes, many of their homes are now Israeli towns and villages. This is the end of the state of Israel. So it's not something that is really something that is tenable. The idea of returning, the fact of returning means not having the state of Israel anymore, and not having the state of Israel, not only not having the state of Israel as the Jewish state or as the land of the Jewish people, it's not having the Jewish people here. There will be no coexistence. There will be, if it does come back, there will be a civil war, and they will outnumber us.
Raz, can I add something to what Pnina said?
Please do.
Think about Lebanon. Lebanon is a classic example of a country which is composed of holding ethnic groups which nobody has a clear majority. And the result is a constant civil strife, sometimes civil war, and certainly a country which is unfunctioning. Doesn't work like that in the Middle East. So that's one thing. The second thing is the near-term Palestinian refugee is a historical anomaly. Because after the Second World War, there were millions of refugees in Europe. There was a UN agency for refugees who took care of them. They were all settled and ceased to be refugees after they were settled. The idea that you can be a refugee forever, for generation after generation after generation, was invented and tailored only for the Palestinians. And it was done not in order to take care of the refugees, because the best way to take care of people is to resettle them and reconstruct their lives. It was done as a cynical ploy of the Arab bloc in the United Nations to keep a thorn on the side of Israel and making these people miserable in squalid refugee camps for generation after generation. I believe that UNRWA has to be cancelled, and this refugee status have to be cancelled, and these people have to be just live a normal life in other places.
Okay. You mentioned Lebanon, so I have a somewhat related question. So let's say that Israel manages to win Gaza and remove Hamas from power. You refer to Hamas as one of the proxies of Iran in a more, I think you call it a circle, I think?
Yeah, a ring of encirclement.
A ring of encirclement. So let's say Israel manages to defeat Hamas. The ring is still there. Hezbollah is still there on the northern border. What stops Hezbollah from replicating the 7th of October? And
first of all, when you have only one threat from the north, you can concentrate your forces better than a situation where you have both from the north and the south. Hezbollah is much stronger than Hamas, one has to admit, so it's a much bigger problem. On the other hand, I'm at odds about the current situation on the northern border because it reminds me a little bit of the situation in Europe before the First World War. Nobody really wants war, but many people believe war is inevitable. And I don't see a solution to solve the political quagmire between Israel and Hezbollah without a war. Because Israel has one interest. You know, Israel wants the people who live in the north to go back to their homes, to resettle the area, because this is part of Israel. It couldn't be a military wasteland. Hezbollah don't want to do that, and these people will be afraid of a Hezbollah invasion. So if Israel doesn't push Hezbollah back across the Litani River, it will be hard to resettle the north. That means that Israel will live in a constant crisis. On the other hand, I don't see a way to remove Hezbollah beyond the Litani without war. I hope there will be an agreement. I'm pessimistic about it. So I would say the chances are 50-50 for a big war in the north. And this will be a very destructive war for Israel. Israel will survive it. It will be more destructive for Lebanon, certainly. I still hope it will be avoided. And what I can also say that Hezbollah is completely trumping a UN resolution. Speaking about a resolution 1701 that should force Hezbollah to disarm and to move beyond the Litani. We expect Israel to follow UN resolutions. How could we expect Israel to follow UN resolutions when its rivals just don't care about them? It's again this unsustainable regime of international law which applies only to certain actors, but others just ignore it. Think about Putin in Russia and Ukraine. It's the same story.
Okay. So Danny just referred to the UN, but I think that there are many different international actors and organizations that could maybe impact and affect the current situation. Pnina, have you seen any concrete suggestions that could help us get to a better post-war reality? I think what I'm trying to ask is, what can international forces do to help us get to a better post-war scenario?
I think that, as we both said, the key to having a better post-war scenario is the defeat of the Hamas. And I think the international community can help us defeat the Hamas by, first of all, not putting all the pressure on Israel to restrain itself in a way that doesn't enable us to beat the Hamas. I agree that we need time. And I think that was part of the plan of the Hamas was to drag us into Gaza, knowing that it's very strong and it has its fortification, that we will need time, that if we have enough time, maybe we will win it, but they plan that we won't have enough time because of the international pressure. So I think the international pressure is actually making, again, it will lead eventually to the Hamas maybe ending victorious, or at least not being defeated. And then we have all the other repercussions that we say, the end of the peace process, the end of the regional peace process, a big blow to the deterrence, also so possible war in the north, strengthening Iran, that is immediately, in the meantime, also racing towards the nuclear capabilities, weapons. So I think the world has to take here a stand and act in a way that looks at the reality as it is, and not again go back to these kinds of concept of notions of because I hear sometimes they say, there's always, I was interviewed, I don't remember where, and they said, well, war is easy, peace is difficult, but why doesn't Israel just take the path of peace? Why are you insisting on war? I mean, insisting on war, peace with Hamas. I mean, we have to understand where we are living and what is the neighborhood and what are the interests, and if the world wants to actually have any kind of potential good result, that's what I have to do at the moment.
Okay, that connects to another question that I've had. There are voices within the Israeli far right that are calling to stop humanitarian aid into Gaza, claiming that it hurts the war effort. Would you connect that to what you've previously said, meaning that the world should kind of look the other way while no humanitarian aid enters Gaza? Or do you think that we still should help the civilians in Gaza as much as we can, while also targeting specifically Hamas?
I don't think it's possible.
Here I
Sorry,
think.
Pnina,
Sorry,
please.
question for Pnina.
Oh, Pnina, sorry.
Sorry. Well, I'll let you afterwards see what you have to say about it. I think that, first of all, we have to understand that one of the main reasons that Hamas in the beginning agreed to the hostage deal was the pressure of supplies that are running low. And Israel did allow then also food supplies and medicine and water. It didn't really stop that. It just there was the minister said something in the beginning of defense, but Israel didn't stop it. But since then, much more is going in. So there is a rationale in limiting the humanitarian assistance to put pressure on the Hamas. But having said that, I think that still we cannot do it if that means having a dire humanitarian situation or reaching some kind of humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. I think that's a problem. I think first of all, I think it links here to the law and to the moral. We do want to retain the moral upper hand, and I think that's one problem. But beyond that, I think then the international pressure will grow. So I think it will put more pressure. The worse the situation, the humanitarian situation is there. Mm-hmm. And the third point, and here I do a little bit disagree with, I think, what Danny said in the beginning, is that eventually it's going to be our problem. Okay, so I think that the only way to beat the Hamas beyond that, it will take a lot of time, is by also having security control in the Gaza Strip, at least for a time and for a while. And once we are there and we are the ones carrying out the security and having the control, we will have eventually, we want maybe the world to come in, the Palestinian, even the Palestinian Authority, if we don't mind, nobody will go there in the meantime, in the beginning, so it will be on us. So if we have the worse the situation is, in the first place, the more responsibility and the more difficult it will be to control afterwards. So I think for all these reasons, combined, I don't think that the right way is to prevent humanitarian access. But of course, we have the right and the obligation to check what is going in, to try to minimize as much as possible that fuel, for example, will reach the Hamas fighters. So anything that can at least minimize that can and should be done.
Mm-hmm. Great, Danny, you want to also add?
I think that in the history of war, siege was a very common tactics. When you have a war, you besiege the enemy. In these two world wars, no one even, when the Americans besieged Japan, no one even thought of bringing humanitarian supplies to Japan. This is a post-World War II invention. I think it's contrary to the logic of war. I don't think it's starving a population. I'm very much against it. That would be a form of genocide. But giving the population an opportunity to surrender. That means that Israel, in order to stop humanitarian supplies, I'm speaking theoretically, not as a political viable option, Israel will have to supply humanitarian aid for civilians who come under its control. That means, again, to have a civil administration, to have refugee camps with humanitarian help, so we can give the people a choice. Or you are with Hamas, and we don't give supplies to our enemies, or you are under our care, and then we take care of you. The problem is that Israel did not make any preparations for it, because Israel in the beginning of the war made a very big mistake. It said two things which are actually contradictory. And the contradiction was apparent to me almost immediately. On the one hand, Defense Minister Gallant said, we will not have any responsibility towards Gaza in the future. No water, no electricity, no medicine, no nothing. On the other hand, he said, we will destroy the Hamas regime and we'll have a security responsibility in Gaza. That doesn't go together. If you have responsibility, you have responsibility for the population. It was difficult to say to the Israelis after October 7th that Israel will take care of Gaza, but you have to tell people the truth. Israel will be responsible for Gaza. In any case, but in an extreme situation, which is not politically viable, that Israel would stop humanitarian aid, it needs to give humanitarian aid to Palestinians under its control at the absolute minimum. And I'd say finally, just so people will understand, everything that gets into Gaza, medicine, fuel, food, go first to Hamas and then to civilians. We have to live with this reality.
Thank you. So I want to move on a bit to a term that if you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in international circles, you hear all the time. And if you talk about it in Israel, you don't hear enough, which is the two-state solution. So is there a future for a two-state solution? And also, what would you say it will look like after the war? Specifically, what will the reality in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip could or should look like? It's a question for both of you, but Danny, you can start.
So I think these are several questions that should be analyzed separately, though they are interconnected. I repeat the concept of Batna that I always repeated. Palestinian state should be a goal, but its establishment should not be unconditional. And I think that's a mistake that the international community had done consistently after the Second World War. If we go back to the 19th century, we have the Montevideo Convention that defines what a state is, what a state should look like. State should have an efficient political control over a territory. It should fulfill several conditions in order to be a state. And the idea was that if a state is recognized, the recognition is actually a reflection of existing reality. That you have an authority that actually controls a territory, and then you give it international recognition. After the decolonization process, due to the justified aversion for European colonialism, actually the world started to recognize states in droves, though many of them did not fill the criteria of the Montevideo Convention. There were fictive, failed states that actually couldn't control a territory. Why? Self-determination. By the same token, many West, like the United States, insisted on democratic elections. Even in societies which didn't have the democratic infrastructure to hold an elections, and what were the result? The elections turned into a civil war. And it happened again and again and again and again. So a Palestinian state should reflect an existing reality of Palestinian institutions which are efficient enough to control a state. So a state should be the end of the process. And I think we should tell our Palestinian neighbors, we are ready to establish a Palestinian state, but you should fill several conditions. A, efficiency. B, education, which is not an education for hate and terror and destroying Israel. C, security control. D, that the state will not be ethnically cleansed of Jews. Just like we have Arabs in Israel who are equal citizens, Jews should have the right to live in the Palestinian state on the same token. We cannot accept a state which is purge of Jews, just like we will never, God forbid, take citizenship for Arabs in Israel. So when these conditions will be fulfilled, I think it could be the goal. But I would say, what is not one of my conditions? Democracy. I don't want to coerce Western values on the Palestinians who are an Islamic Arab society. They will remain an Islamic Arab society. That's their tradition. I don't want them to be a carbon copy of Israel and the United States. If at all you have good models in the Gulf, how to construct an Arab Muslim conservative society which is also peaceful. And I think that should be the model for a Palestinian state.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, what you're suggesting is, like, I've picked up two things that you've suggested. One of them is a sort of de-Hamasification of Palestinian society through education. And the other one, which I'm going to go back to, was kind of, I think if I understood correctly, you implied that Israeli settlements should not be removed from the West Bank, but rather should be allowed to stay under Palestinian rule.
It depends. I think that our illegal outposts that clearly took Palestinian private land should be evacuated, and these kind of violent elements which cannot live peacefully in a Palestinian state. But I do think people who live in, let's say, normal established settlements should have the option to live peacefully with their Palestinian neighbors if they want to remain. I think that most of them will not want. But I cannot accept the idea that the Palestinian state will be purged of Jews. I think it's unhuman. And also, I think that a very important issue, which I didn't mention before, is mutual recognition. Just as we recognize, and we should recognize in the end, Palestinian self-determination after they fulfill the conditions, they should recognize Israel as a Jewish state and put a complete end to the conflict. I think that should be a must.
Okay. Pnina, how do you see a future two-state solution happening? If you see
it's very difficult to see it. I think it should be the goal. I think it would take many years. And I can't see it in the near future. I agree that was the last point, that it has to be. I mentioned that I've been in the track to those Palestinians. In one of them, usually we talked about very practical issues, more access, how to economic issues, potential security arrangements. But once we decided to talk a little bit about the core values. And then I had a very interesting exchange with a Palestinian woman. She was very eloquent. She lives in the US, very impressive. And then we were talking about this idea of two states, and the Palestinian state that fulfills the right of the Palestinian nation people for self-determination, and Israel as the fulfillment of the Jewish people's right of self-determination. And I said, that's one of the, and then she said, no, but Judaism is just a religion. It's not a nation. So sorry. I don't know what, I'm secular. So I don't believe in all the religious stuff, and I'm still a very proud Jew, but it's my national identity. It's not my religious identity. She said, no, but Judaism is not, there's no nation, there's no Jewish nation, there's just a religion. I told her, look, I'm not telling you if you are part of the Arab nation, or if there is such a Palestinian nation, or maybe it's all Arab nation. It's your right to self-determination. You have to accept it. I also have a right to self-determination. And then I understood, and this is people that want, yes, this is track 2, between people that want peace, that this is a big issue. And I think that the 7th of October, again, I said it before, it's a huge issue. So I think that's one thing. With regard to the settlements, I did an analysis of different concepts of a one state, actually, but they included the idea of confederation, which is two states, actually. But I also analyzed that. I also analyzed the federation and autonomy and the confederation, and try to see how it will work in reality. And I think that the friction of living Israelis there, especially if the Israelis that remain are the ones that have the strongest ideological ties, and are usually the most, I would say, that are ideologically, there's the most friction there between the Palestinians that have their ideological ideas and the settlers that have their ideological ideas. So I think that leaving them to live inside the Palestinian state is a recipe for disaster. And on the other hand, today the Israeli political environment, I don't see how settlements, especially of the ideological settlers, how they are evacuated.
Why?
So, because I think that it will not work from the Israeli internal political. They are very strong politically, the ideological right in Israel. And especially now, if now we're talking about the day after now, I think you see 80% of the Palestinians in the West Bank are now pro-Hamas. So they don't see any chance of accepting Israel's existence. So there's nobody there. But also in the Israeli society, if you look now at this moment, I think the vast majority of Israelis are not ready to make any kind of compromise with the Palestinians, even those that don't have ideological ties to the land, the greater land of Israel, but because complete mistrust, the other idea is they all want to, and also, 80% support the Hamas, so it works. They all want to murder us, to throw us away. The moment we leave any area and they have the control there, the next day they will be attacking us from there. So this is the sentiment, the widespread sentiment in Israel. That's why I don't see anything in the near future. And I also have a difficulty to see how it happens in the further future. I think then maybe we have a question here of leadership on both sides to find some creative compromises.
I think that one of the questions that were sent to us was whether we think that there is any future for Netanyahu to remain in power. And if it's okay with you, I think I would like to say a few things on that, putting my hat as a political analyst for a moment, saying that while there is very wide agreement both in the right wing and the left wing that Netanyahu has finished his role as prime minister, I think that is very premature to decide. And you can see in Netanyahu's rhetoric that he already found the one campaign that might keep him in power, and that is campaigning against the two-state solution, because he has found that all of the responsible actors within Israeli politics clearly understand and state that this could only end eventually in a two-state solution. I think that's also true for the panel that we have here. Netanyahu is currently juggling, saying to the world and to Biden he's not against the two-state solution, but then internally saying to everyone who would listen that he would never let a two-state solution happen if he's kept in power, kind of trying to rebuild his right-wing base. And I think that also connects to the previous question of why does Israel keep building settlements? And that is because that is how Netanyahu stays in power. Again, I'm not saying that he will stay in power. I'm saying that he's working very hard to do so. And if the two of you have anything to add, then please
I think I agree with what you said, mostly. But I do think his time is up. Because if you are against the Palestinian state so much, it's not that Lapid or Gantz are going to establish one tomorrow. You can vote for Smotrich or for Ben Gvir, for the extreme right. And Netanyahu is disliked by many on the right as well. And his ardent supporters sometimes resemble for me a mystical cult that is becoming, in my opinion, it's still big, but it's becoming smaller and smaller, but who knows?
I could just add that Israeli politics, and it's not unique only to Israel, but here it's also an issue with the whole polarization and drifts, but also the whole issue of the post-truths, the subjective truths. If you tune into one channel, you'll get one version of events, of facts. You tune into a different channel, different facts. So I fear that this war has, in the beginning, especially united us against this common enemy, but the rifts and are still there, and this makes it even more challenging to see how we get out of this crisis. And unfortunately, Netanyahu, that had this golden opportunity to become again a leader that will do the right thing, remain the politician that is not doing the right thing.
I must add, the way that kind of alternative facts and fake news kind of got into the discourse. A few months ago, I saw a mom walking with a little girl on the street on Tel Aviv, and she yelled on her daughter, "You told me that your sister stole your ice cream, and that's fake news. I'm telling you, that's fake news." So I'm just trying to say that it kind of got very deep into the fabric of culture, this kind of discourse on fake news.
Um, it has become like it's everywhere. And I think it's for the best. That I mean, fake news is obviously bad, but I think that the
She
fact
said
that
fake news in English, by the way. She was speaking in Hebrew, but she used the term fake
but the
news
fact that
in
people
English.
use the term means that people are also becoming more critical thinkers,
Yeah.
because that's the second part
Wow.
of it. So I'm trying to be optimistic after all.
Yes.
And talking about the opposite of optimism, another political question that we have is, what do you expect to happen if Trump comes back into power? Specifically in our case, and also in the Russian-Ukraine case. So I'll divide it by asking Pnina about Israel and Dani about Ukraine.
I just came back from NATO, by the way, so they're very worried. Trump is a wild card. I mean, I think the main problem with Trump is that you don't know what to expect. It doesn't always act as one expects him to. So on the one hand, he's been very supportive of Israel, and also he doesn't have this a problem of being politically correct, and so let's say the progressive left that is supporting the Hamas will be less have less impact. So there are some good things about it. On the other hand, if it entails finance, giving providing forces or any kind of financial support for a long time, or putting the US out of its way to support Israel, then Trump is not necessarily so you can't rely on him on these kind of things. I also don't know, but I have a big question mark about the influence of Russia on Trump. I don't know. Again, talking about fake news, I really already don't know what to believe there. So I don't know. It's too many question marks for me to give something definite. Nikki Haley, I wouldn't mind, but and Biden, I really admire, but I don't know about Trump.
So about Ukraine, I'm very afraid for Ukraine, and I think just to tell my own position, I was a very strong supporter of Ukraine from day one, and I think the fate of Ukraine may be the fate of the West. And we are speaking now to a German audience, and Germany is very worried. You see that Germany is increasing the defense budget, and Poland is increasing its army. So there is a very good reason for being worried. Ukrainians are being drained out of ammunition. That's one of the biggest problems. So I was very afraid that Trump will stab the Ukrainians in the back, which is a very reasonable option given Trump's position now. On the other hand, recently, I cannot imagine a worse situation for Ukraine than the current situation, because Biden is pro-Ukrainian. Of course, though one can debate about the extent of its support, but the main issue is that the Republicans, mainly out of hate for Biden, are sabotaging everything that has to do with help to Ukraine, and Ukraine doesn't get a budget. There is a certain chance that if Trump will be president and if the Ukrainians will flatter him enough, he may change his position, and then the Republicans will be behind him and help to Ukraine will be approved. But I don't know. It's just a wild hope. I think that Ukraine needs to think about other sources of ammunition. And it's really, really a very big problem. I'm very, very worried.
On this pessimistic note, I want to go even further and go to a somewhat pessimistic question. You might have heard I think in the Israeli discourse, there is this notion that whenever there's a war in Gaza, that you're creating the next generation of anti-Israeli Palestinians. And I think that in that regard, it's fair to ask, are we, by the extent of the war currently waged in Gaza, growing another generation of people that will do everything to destroy Israel in Gaza, but not only, like generally in the region? Like, are we hurting again, if we're talking about the day after, sure, let's say we remove Hamas from power. What stops us from creating a population that would support like the something that isn't technically Hamas, but it's practically the same thing?
So I'll answer in two parts, if possible. First of all, I think that's why the education system is so important. And a very, very good sign that a new Palestinian Authority will really have a new peaceful strategy towards Israel are educational reforms. War breeds hatred all the time. Nothing to do against it. Even in an ideal case, when you observe, it has to do with my current research and the book I'm writing, so I'm confident speaking about it. Even if you preserve all of the rules of armed conflict to the letter in a strict interpretation, still war is hell and it causes a lot of damage and a lot of carnage and a lot of hate. International humanitarian law helps only on the margins, if at all. And on the other hand, I don't see more hatred to Israel in Palestine than it is now. So the Palestinian #1 national goal is now to destroy Israel. So if you just don't react and let them do so, will it help you that the next generation will be maybe less hateful? I'm not sure. First, you need to win. Then you need to speak about the next generation.
Pnina?
I agree. I think we see that the education, these children these youngsters that are fighting us, they are. I don't know if you can hate us more than that. I mean, we saw on the 7th of October, beyond the Nukhba and the organized groups that came, the terrorists that came afterwards, there was this wave of Gazans that just swept, and they did terrible things, and clearly they treated the Israelis and anybody in Israel, even non-Jews, but Jews as non-human. It was clearly hatred, torture someone so terribly and mutilate and cut people up alive and then brutally. This is the way you treat what you hate more than that you. So I think it's already there. Is the war creating more hatred? Yes. I mean, first of all, we have to understand the situation in Gaza is terrible. I mean, it is terrible. I don't think that and if we could do anything to stop what's happening there, that would be good. That would be also in our interest. First of all, as human beings, I don't want them to suffer, and I don't want this next generation of hatred. The point is that it can't stop. It's in the hands of the Hamas. I mean, if the Hamas surrenders, the war ends. But if Hamas doesn't surrender, so we spoke already a few times already about why Israel can't end the war with Hamas retaining control over Gaza. And so I think, yes, there is a lot of hatred. We have to address afterwards the education system, but it's not going to be easy. But it's something that has to be done. Here also the international community can help. Because in the past, when Israel did raise concerns about the textbooks of the Palestinian schools, it wasn't treated seriously. So maybe it should be treated more seriously. And I think eventually we will have to try to find bridges there was an annex to the interim agreement, people to people. It was a very nice annex. It was all kinds of initiatives to do to bring the people to know each other and to trust each other. It was never ever implemented. So these things need to be implemented. At the moment, it's difficult to see. Both sides are really not exactly in the mood of talking to the other side. By the way, none of my Palestinian colleagues called me after 7th of October either. So it's not an easy situation now to talk about these kinds of initiatives, but eventually we will need it.
I think we're out of time, but I would like to have one final question. Hopefully that will be okay. And it could be either a philosophical question or a political question, because we don't have time for both. So I wanted to ask, which would you prefer?
Let's say philosophical, we spoke about politics too much.
So,
what do you think? Philosophical?
I'm terrible with philosophical questions.
No, it's
but
not a big
answer, and then I'll add a sentence.
So, we've talked a lot about the war goal, which is to defeat the Hamas regime. But in fact, domestically in Israel, there are two declared war goals. One of them is to defeat the regime, and the other one is to return the hostages. Now, these two goals are essentially contradictory, because Hamas will only give back the hostages in order to avoid being defeated. So I would say, because it was said a few times that we have to win. But then again, can we win? Because if we have two goals and we can only achieve one of the two goals, how can we win?
Easiest way, if the main goal would be to release the hostages, then Israel could have given the Hamas what it wanted on day one, and there is no need for war, and no need for carnage, and no need for sacrifices on both sides. That would have been very easy. The truth is that the goal of the war is to destroy Hamas, and releasing the captives is only a secondary goal. I'm not a politician, so I can say it. Because if you surrender to somebody who extort you, you will be extorted more next time. So now we may surrender and release all prisoners. What will we do? And these prisoners are terrorists who will murder people, I have no doubt. What will we do when they kidnap the next batch of Israelis, maybe abroad, this time, maybe on the northern border, and they demand us to, let's say, give up territory? But lives of hostages is number one, right? So give them what they want. Why won't you? We gave them what they wanted last time. The way to defeat extortion is not to surrender to extortion. Never, ever.
Pnina?
No, I'm not sure I agree here. I think that the hostages and release of the hostages is also crucial for returning some kind of sense of security, some kind of sense of trust in the government. I think if the hostages are continue to be held there indefinitely, it is also a victory of Hamas. So I think it's a more question again of patience. I think the main problem that we have is so I think if we can get the hostages back at the moment in some kind of a deal, but still retain the Hamas is at the moment weaker than, and it doesn't control most of the Gaza Strip. Okay, and it is underground. The leaders are underground, so it's not as if it's totally, back in the track. So I think that if we manage, and here we do need, as I said before, the government is making it difficult also by not making any concessions with regard to the political price needs to be paid to have more involvement of international actors and to have like a bigger deal, because a victory over the Hamas from Israel perspective, if we make a deal with the Saudis, that is also a kind of victory, because that is one of the reasons the Hamas went to war, at least the timing. And so I think that we have to look here outside the box. And I think, yes, we need that they won't be victorious. We need, at least I said, not to lose to them. But I'm not sure that it cannot be combined somehow. As long as we retain still that we know it will take time, we will continue to fight them afterwards. We will continue to somehow, I think the key is, unfortunately, it didn't go so, but the key is controlling the Philadelphia route, controlling the border with Egypt, so it cannot strengthen itself again. And then things can take time, and then we can still do the hostages first and still deal with the Hamas, but we need time to do it and patience. I wouldn't give up on the hostages. I think that's something. This is not so even just soldiers that went in and were taken captive. These are people that were in their homes inside Israel. And I think that this is what is the state for? The state, why are we living in a state? In order to give us security in our homes, that we won't come, no, that the enemy will not come in and abduct us. I think this is the basic contract. And the state is not an entity that has, in my view, of validity in itself. So I think we have to find a way to combine the things. It doesn't mean that the government needs to show more flexibility, I think, on the political level, on the international front, more than it's doing at the moment. That's the price that needs to be paid.
Thank you. I'm actually quite pleased that your answers are contradictory. I think that gives a good example of the current Israeli discourse regarding what should be prioritized. And I wanted to thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Okay, and thank you for all of our participants. I tried kind of working in most of the questions that I was sent, and I answered a few of you privately because we didn't get to the questions. And if anything else is still open, you can email me or whatever after the Zoom ends. I'll try to answer today, tomorrow.